The Perennial Motivator. Chapter 1. Escape. An explosion so impactful and shrill that it causes the very air in a mile radius to ripple is echoing over a ruined airfield. A young man is thrown out of a large hangar, which now lies in flames. He wakes not long after, the freezing chill of the rain being the only thing grounding his consciousness to the world. His vision blurring, his hearing numbed, and his body shooting with pain as he tries to stand and run from the nightmare pursuing him. He pulls himself to his feet and tightens the crude wrapping around the stump just beneath his right elbow. He's losing blood far quicker than he expected, and there are still no ships in sight. Panic sets in as he weakly stumbles away from the remains of the hangar. It's coming, and he knows his luck is running out with each drop of blood he loses. The thoughts racing through the man's mind go blank as a primal need to survive sets in. His wobbling limp shifts to a pain gait, then a focused sprint. Pain and fear escape his body as he weaves through the rubble and bodies strewn across the field. Another explosion rings out, this time further down the field, toward the tree line. The man's eyes cut towards the now illuminated row of ships. Every one of their mangled frames sits in a bath of flames, except for two. They streak across the sky in opposite directions as a bitter, bloodthirsty screeching cuts through the sound of their engines. He feels relief for a moment as he watches the ships escape, but it's quickly intercepted by sheer focus and will as he turns and sprints for the other side of the field. In the darkness he can make out a few large silhouettes that he's hoping are ships. He begins climbing onto the nearest one, a small speeder capable of low-range planet hopping, when he hears the twisted rippling of flames being pushed by the wind. His head turns towards its source as he launches himself backwards off the ship. He hits the grass and tumbles with no grace or control as his first hope of escape is pierced through by the remnants of a flaming tree. Still lying in the grass, he pokes his now bleeding head out to see a set of volatile movements in the dark headed for his position. He shuffles to his feet and makes his final sprint towards the next ship. It's got an odd shape. It's quite large, but there is a distinct loading ramp for him to scale. The sound of heavy breathing and claws scraping the concrete behind him drown out even his own heartbeat. He nears closer to the entrance, and his pursuer nears closer to him. In one movement, he crosses the threshold and slams his fist into the bright orange emergency lock. Mere seconds after the door slams shut, he's almost thrown to the floor as the entire ship is rocked from a sudden impact. The scraping and thuds on the outside of the ship only become more desperate as he climbs a set of stairs leading towards the wheelhouse. The man bursts into the wheelhouse and begins hastily setting coordinates for the autopilot system when he catches a glimpse of an eye peering through the glass and directly into his very being. He'd never seen so much rage and unfiltered hate in any one creature. The only spark of joy that can be seen is the pleasure it takes in him lying on death's doorstep with nothing but fear in his heart. It breaks its focus on the man for only a second to rear its head. The darkness shrouds the beast entirely, save for the ends of a few teeth that appeared more like jagged shards of obsidian than anything belonging to an organic being. Focus takes the man's mind once more as he dove for the accelerator lever jutting from the control board. With that push, the ship's thrusters fire off and launch its hull into the bottom of the pursuer's gaping maw, knocking it backwards to the ground. Even with the scream of the thrusters directly below him, and the ever-growing distance as the ship pushes upwards to exit the atmosphere, the man can still hear the beast's resentful roaring rattling through his skull. He slumps backwards into the captain's chair and takes a breath. The pain and exhaustion of fighting so desperately for his life catch up to him. Soon after, the oppressive chill of blood loss and the seductive warmth of losing consciousness consumed him. His body goes limp, and his eyes go dark as he sighs with relief. He's not certain he's safe, but he's certainly done fighting. Chapter 2. Change. The man wakes in his seat to the sound of radio static as his ship slowly drifts towards its destination. He rises to his feet and immediately falls forward towards the control board. His legs are too weak to carry him, and his body too broken and battered to even push off of the board for support. He slowly scans the room as he tries to control his shaky, shallow breathing. Near the entrance, he spots a first aid container. With a sharp breath and clenched teeth, he crawls with every ounce of strength left in his body towards the entrance. In one final push, he manages to yank the container open, spilling its contents on the floor around his bruised and broken body. His eyes jump from object to object, searching for anything to give him the most instant relief. A red vial with a safety cap covering a needle catches his eye. Without moving from his spot on the floor, he slides it into his weakened grip and pries the cap off with his teeth. With all the power he has, the man slams the needle into his right bicep before letting out a pained groan as the medicine forces his body to cramp and tighten as if his muscles were going to rip themselves to shreds. After what felt like hours, but was actually no more than 60 seconds, the tension releases its hold on the man's body, and the instant relief brings him to euphoric bliss. He feels strong, energized. His thoughts race too quickly to make sense of anything around him. All he can feel at this point is an eruption of power surging through him, its roar deafening the internal sirens warning him to protect his rapidly dying body. It begins to overwhelm the senses, and his only reaction is to let out a scream, closer to a roar, deep from within his soul. Perhaps it's the strain of screaming, or the tightening of his muscles as he pushes every bit of air from his lungs, but the release of power grounds him to his situation. There's a message coming in. He has no idea where in the galaxy he is. He isn't sure if he's still being pursued, and he is almost certainly dying. He rushes to the captain's seat and begins tuning the comms to hear the incoming message. As he turns the dials, a young, audibly irate man's voice emerges from the static.
"This is your final warning. Transmit your identification and state your purpose on Gunlach. Respond now or we will be forced to board your ship."
His thoughts run alongside the panic rushing through his mind. Gunlach? They don't even have a government. How the hell do they have a border patrol? He breathes to clear his mind. He has no time to think this through. He must act quickly before things end up worse. He's half dead, with no ID and a stolen ship that he barely knows how to operate. His instincts lead him to his only option. He brings the drifting ship to a complete stop and straps himself into the captain's chair. He takes a sharp breath and rests his hand on the throttle before opening the comms link to say, "I'm not well, and neither are my crew. Please, we need medical attention now."
"Copy that. Stay put. We're boarding to gather your information and detain your crew."
"Thank you. The entrance to my ship is located in the center stern. I'll have the doors ready to open."
"Copy."
2 docking pods place themselves on the ship's left and right side to form a gravity field around it. As it's forming, the man readies himself, prepared to do whatever he must to escape. The pods carry his ship to a docking platform connecting to a space station loosely orbiting Gunlach, just past the majority of their defenses. The pods spin the ship and place it backwards onto the platform as the man prepares his launch. There's a brief window between when the gravity fields release and the hangar hatches close around the ship, creating a nearly unbreakable seal. This window is his chance. The pods release, and he punches it. The plasma from his ship's afterburners lights the area with a blinding neon blue glow and melts down the first layer of the platform. The ship launches from the platform as the hatches just barely miss it. He cuts hard, downward and right, to loop underneath the station and speed towards Gunlach. It only takes about 10 seconds for him to have speeders on his tail, but with the speed they're going, 10 seconds makes a world of difference. He streaks through space, 4 speeders directly behind him, as he breaks the atmosphere and pulls up slightly. He vaguely remembers where to go, or at least the general area of what he's looking for. He got lucky in this case, as his destination is a nearby city that can be seen from where he is. There's no way he could land without crashing at this speed, but if he slows down even a little, he'll be gunned from the sky before he even has a chance to crash. He takes another breath and focuses as he relays his knowledge of his ship. It's meant for long-distance travel and transportation, carrying a crew from system to system. He could outlast them, keep this pace as the speeders run out of fuel. No, the longer I stay in their vision, the higher the risk of them sending more ships. He could look for some kind of defensive rockets to shoot them down, then ditch the ship and hide. No. If they establish me as a major threat for downing 4 speeders, it'll go from a local pursuit to a planetary manhunt. These ships are equipped with dozens of escape pods. He could use one to blast off into the local swampland. No. They'll destroy the pod the second it launches. Unless... He's got it. He veers the ship over the city and pulls low, just above the tree line,
evens it out before turning on the autopilot to keep straight. He sets the autopilot to land after 30 minutes of flight, then runs out of the cockpit, follows the signs until he arrives at the escape pod launching bay, where he begins launching pods. He can hear some of them being shot down, and others making it to the ground. He runs to the other side of the bay to set others on a launch timer of different amounts. 20 seconds, 45 seconds, 3 minutes, 2 minutes. He runs back to launch a few more, and sets 4 more at 20 seconds, and 4 more at 10, before hopping in a pod, launching himself the second he hears the nearby pods launching. His timing is off. His pod does ever so slightly stand out amongst the others, but the rain of lasers miss him all the same. He peeks out of the pod's window to see the ship spraying a steady rain of pods from different locations as the speeders desperately try to hunt them down, all while keeping pace. He's in the clear for now, but the drugs are wearing off as pain and nausea sweeps his body. His pod roughly slides and rolls along the ground before the muddy terrain pulls it to a halt. The internal gyro flips him one last time, so the entrance is facing upwards before popping open. He wastes no time in struggling to jump out of the pod before jumping out and into the hot, loose mud. He scans the area to see a steady line of open pods leading deeper into the swamps before looking back towards his pod, which sat at the end of a long crater where it slid upon impact. He clenches his remaining fist, takes a deep breath, and heads in the opposite direction of the pod's crater. For roughly 300 feet, he drags his aching, beaten body through sawgrass, knee-deep mud, and thick roots. Through all of that, though, he arrives in town. Stumbling and barely conscious, he pushes his way through a series of back alleys. He tries his best to avoid any kind of attention from Gunlach's occupying force until he encounters some kind of familiarity. Before long, he recognizes the alley behind a club he used to frequent. He stares at its back door and debates going in to get some rest until he dies amongst the dancers, but ultimately decides he's not quite over living just yet. With one last push, he turns a few more corners before ending up in front of a building surrounded by various kinds of potted flowers and plant life from all over the galaxy. He takes a moment to absorb the deep purple glow of the neon sign above the doors that read, Soul Seekers, in elegant lettering. He's overcome by joy and relief to see they're still in business, because if anybody can save him without asking many questions, it's Dez and Cash.
Chapter 3. Impulse. The man had no strength left to push, so he put his weight against the door until he fell through onto the store's floor. He hit with a solid, almost lifeless thud onto what remained of his right arm, causing a spurt of blood to push out into his makeshift bandage. Despite the pain, he couldn't scream. He just rolled to his back and tried to fix his eyes on one of the 2 men in the store. His eyes linked with the younger of the 2 men, Dez. He stood from his seat behind the counter and flipped the brim of his hat upwards in disbelief, as if a clearer view would make sense of the man dying on his floor. Shock had overcome the southern gentleman as he realized the soon-to-be corpse in front of him was his friend. He managed to speak, or at least try to. "Bass," he said before his soft but panicked voice was cut off by the harsh and commanding voice of his partner. "Don't just stand there, Dez. We need to get him in the van now," Cash said as he rushed his large insectoid frame across the store to the aid of the man. Dez readjusted his hat back onto his head before speaking in a far more focused tone. "Right. I'll get everything ready." Cash nodded as he began examining the man's body. His eyes began to glow a dull green color, and his antennae hummed as he prodded at the man. He was just finishing as Dez honked the horn out front. He carefully lifted the man and peeked out of the windows before rushing him into the back of the van. The moment the doors closed, Dez sped around the corner, and Cash began strapping the man down into their makeshift stretcher. As Dez sped down their designated route, Cash slipped the bloodied cloth off of the man's stump. Most of the blood had become crusted and congealed due to a clotting powder that had been crudely poured into the wound some time ago. Though there was the occasional spurt of blood pushing through as the powder began to clump together and fall from the wound. He gripped his arm and spoke softly in a remorseful tone. "I'm sorry, son. This is gonna hurt." The man's eyebrows twitched in response to his friend's warning. He'd seen Cash do this before, and he'd seen the terrible reactions it got, but at this point he figured he was so numb and drained that no amount of pain could really make it worse. He was wrong. Cash's mandible split wide and a spray of steaming acid spewed directly onto the man's stump. The acid was so volatile and hot that it was consistently sterile,
but unbelievably painful to any form of creature lacking an exoskeleton. It twisted and mangled the flesh, bone, and muscle on and around his stump in order to completely close off the wound with itself. The man let out a scream so visceral and primal that Cash and Des both couldn't help but to shiver and recoil. They'd seen and handled pain before, but this was different. The man was basically already dead, and yet here he was, screaming and writhing from a pain that should have ended a long time ago. The wound was closed, and the man would live a little longer. The van sped down a straight shot to their destination, and the man was unconscious once again. It was quiet, and they all had a moment to breathe. Des peeked into the rearview mirror to glance at his lover. He was swept away by his call to action, and how diligently he was able to save lives without a second thought. He admired Cash's genuine kindness and bravery, and only wished he could be half of what he loved so much about him. His thoughts drifted to their life together, how lucky he was to have found what he did. He made it. He made a difference and found love in a world torn by greed and hatred. The reality of the current situation struck into his heart once more, and his smile faded. This was no time to daydream. "What's the damage?" he spoke, the warm twang of his voice soothing Cash's aching nerves. "We got a broken collarbone, internal bleeding, severe concussion, some nasty bruises, and clearly a missing arm. I'm not sure what could have even happened to him, let alone how the hell he managed to get here alive," he said curiously before smirking and correcting himself. "Well, kind of alive. He's always been stubborn. I know we don't know him that well, but it's difficult to imagine him even considering giving up, even when he should." Cash chuckled and added, "Especially when he should." Des laughed a little harder than he should, and fell back to silence before pulling up to an abnormally large greenhouse in a clearing far from any form of civilization. They both hopped out with a focused urgency and pulled the man from his spot in the van. They softly carried him on the stretcher into the greenhouse, past the hordes of flowers and small, fruit-bearing plants, to the many large interconnected tanks of enhanced water in the back. They laid the stretcher down, and Cash began turning the pressure valves for the water in a very specific order until a hatch in the floor slowly slid open, the dirt previously covering it collapsing down onto the stairs beneath it. The two men carried him downstairs to a lab full of large tanks connected to cumbersome, almost robotic suits via the tubes that plugged into the backs. 4 out of the 5 total suits were closed and sitting face first in what looked like a half-circle pod where the suits locked into place. The closed suits were full of liquid that was slowly being funneled out and replaced by the liquid in the tank. The one empty suit lay lifeless next to its tank. Cash began locking the suit into its pod while Des unstrapped the man from his stretcher. Together, they lifted him, each grabbing an arm and leg so he stayed in a seated position. Feet first, they gently slid him into the suit. Cash fastened all the tubes into the back, and Des input a code into the monitor fastened to the side of the tank. With a mechanical whir and electronic whine, the suit closed. Not long after, lights along the back of the suit began to flicker before glowing a deep orange. The two men sighed in relief as the monitor began displaying steady vitals, and the speaker located at the peak of the pod began spitting static before clearing. Exhausted, but beaming with relief, the man's voice came through. "Thank you." Cash spoke softly into the microphone located on the monitor. "Of course. You've always done your best to do right by us in the past. It's only right we do the same." "I'll get you guys your payment, and then some once I'm out of the suit. I promise." Des chimed in. "Take your time, sugar. We know you're good for it." "Des, you're here too. Listen, I'm sorry about probably staining your floors. I'll see about getting some professional cleaning for that." Des tried his best to cover the sounds of his dry heaving at the thought of all the blood caked onto his floors at this point before speaking. It's okay. We got it." Cash began comfortably rubbing Dez's back as he spoke in a more professional and focused tone. "Now then, do you understand the process you're going through? Why you're in that suit, and what's going to happen to you?" "No, I don't think so." Cash's voice trailed, taken by solemn guilt. "We're not fully equipped to save you, as you currently are. Your body's just too far beyond repair, so our only real option is to break you down into your rawest components, then remake you." "That isn't so bad. I mean, as long as I'm alive and at least mostly able, then I could figure out the rest. I admire your optimism, but there are some other details you should know. Good news and bad news, in fact. Give them to me, the man said with confidence. Well, the good news is that you will be able to get your arm back, and you should be more than able. The bad news is that we don't have any control over how you'll reform. In other words, we don't know what you'll be once you exit the suit. He tried, and failed, to cover the fear and uncertainty in his voice. Why not? Cash went to speak again, but Des laid a hand on his shoulder and gestured for him to sit down. Exhaustion was weighing on him, and he needed his rest. Cash ascended the stairs to keep lookout and get some fresh air. Taking his place, Des spoke. The way this whole process works is simple, but can't really be given any form of intervention. The suit you're in works as a controlled, safe, and sterile environment. The tank you're hooked up to contains a gel-like substance, positively bursting with stem cells and nanomachines that are going to put you together based on information fed to them by your soul cells. And what are soul cells? Soul cells are essentially you. They're small cells that work together as a sort of hive mind to store all the things that make up who you are. Your memories, personality, love, hate, passion, everything in between. Every sentient creature in the galaxy has them. Isn't that what the brain's for? Kinda, Des said inquisitively. Picture that your brain is like the main processor of a computer, and the soul cells are every little bit of personalized data in its rawest form. The brain helps to process, sort, and make sense of all the things that the soul cells say. The soul cells are you, down to your truest form. The brain is just the thing that adds in outside influence like societal standards on top of allowing you to actually express the traits the soul cells hold. I think I get it. So, how do they work together to make a new me? This is the interesting part. The critters are... The man's voice burst through the speaker. Critters? You gonna put bugs in the suit? Des rushed to speak. No. That's just an industry term for the nanomachines. Oh, sorry, the man said with a slight twinge of embarrassment in his voice. It's okay, sugar. Though I don't know why you'd be so concerned. Insects are some of the most beautiful and kind and driven, caring. His voice trailed as a slight smile formed between his snow-white goatee. He cut his train of thought off and cleared his head before speaking again. I'm getting distracted, I'm sorry. The man let forth a pained chuckle. You're fine. I know what it's like to be in love, especially during hard times. Des gave a warm smile and resumed. The critters are going to copy and process all of that information from the soul cells as they extract them from your current body and put them into the gel. As they do that, they'll pass that processed information off to the stem cells, which will then begin rebuilding your body as they see fit based on said information. Basically, you'll be rebuilt around your soul cells, and the end result should be something entirely new. In a way, it's like a metamorphosis, right? Like I'm becoming my truest self because I'm being built around who I am, not my genetics. Exactly. In a genetic sense, you'll be completely unrecognizable. You may even become physically unrecognizable. In fact, it's quite unlikely you'll be the same species. Is that why this is illegal? Because damn near anyone could just rebuild themselves and escape the law? Des was quiet for a moment. He hated that aspect of the business that he and Cash had entered. He spoke softly. Yes, but Cash and I don't do this just for anybody. We usually do a thorough background check to make sure people's reasons are pure. You don't have to tell me that, Des. You're good people. Probably the only ones on this forsaken planet. Maybe. Des looked over at the suit the man laid in and spoke in a cheerful tone. Good folks like you visit us all the time. They just don't tend to stick around for long. I'd hardly say I qualify as good folks. Maybe just a different breed of bad, the man said in a joking manner. You're a good man. Otherwise we wouldn't be doing this for you. The man remained silent for a moment. If he could feel his face, he's sure he'd be blushing. He spoke in a strong tone. How long does this process take? Well, we're actually going to put you under for about a week.
It'll feel like a quick little afternoon nap for you, but during that period we'll be watching you and making any changes needed, such as adding more stem cells or critters. Over that week, your soul cells will be transferred into the gel. Once the process is complete, you'll be completely in tune with the suit, as well as being able to control the gel. It'll be clunky, hard to control at first, but you'll get accustomed to it in no time.
So, I'll be a mech?
Yes, you'll be a mech. You'll need to come back for bi-weekly checkups so that we can make adjustments to help the process move along more smoothly. With those checkups, it'll take about 6 months. Now, I understand you live a rather, he cleared his throat, adventurous life, so if you're unable to return for your maintenance, it would take about 3 years for the process to be completed.
That's a long time to be stuffed in a mech suit. I'll be sure to stick around.
Good. We have extra lodgings here. You're welcome to stay for as long as you want.
You two are too nice to me. I appreciate it. And I promise I will return the favor.
I know. Do you have any other questions?
Yes, actually.
The man's voice moved to a more curious pitch.
What happens to my old body? What if I leave the suit early?
Your old body will be mostly dissolved and used for fuel for the stem cells. Assuming you end up being built as a vertebrate, your old skeleton may be preserved to be used as a base to build upon. And it depends on just how early, but the result could be anything from an unfinished and likely to form creature to death.
Assuming I'm alone, how do I know when it's time?
Your new body will have absorbed all the gels, so you'll begin feeling more like you're wearing the suit rather than being the suit.
This whole process is so dope.
It is, isn't it? Des said with a childlike enthusiasm in his voice. He shifted back to his work voice and spoke. Are you ready to go under?
I think so,
the man muttered with slight hesitation. Des called Cash back in so that they could begin the process. After reading all the man's vitals and checking the counts on the critters and stem cells, Cash spoke into the microphone with relief and hope beaming through his voice. We'll see you in a week, kid. Sleep well. The man's voice pushed through the speakers.
Much love. I'll see you in a blink.
Chapter 4. Echoes. The orange lights on the man's suit flickered to life once again, except this time, as they lit up, so did his vision. The 10 round lights that acted as his eyes sat on the thick, mechanical dome that would be the man's new head. As most of his senses returned to him, he could feel the cold but soft ground beneath his back, hear the sound of wind blowing down the stairs, see the broken lights overhead being consumed by vines. He instinctively gained control of his body and tried to sit up. Between the weight of the suit and the masses of coiling vines nesting in and over his cold, mechanical body, he could barely move. He was weak, but he desperately began fighting to tear away the vines holding him down. Once he'd gotten into a flow of how to move again, and he'd ripped away most of the vines, he sat up and scanned the room. No. His thoughts raced as fear set in. The entire room was overtaken by vines and moss. The other suits were missing, and next to their tanks were varying skeletons. The tanks containing gel were broken, and the walls behind them were riddled with bullet holes. Shit. The man managed to stumble to his feet, his whole body feeling foreign, heavy and stiff. He could barely even balance himself properly as the weight of an entirely new, clunky, metallic body pulled him one way or the other. He cut his sight down around the pod he was previously in. No skeleton, but the tank was busted and the tubes cut. Confusion and worry swirled through him as he braced himself on the pods. As his eyes wandered, he noticed bloodstains in the stairway and a body near the base of the stairs. He looked away and stared blankly at the mossy turf beneath, too shaken and afraid to confirm his fears. If he knew how yet, he'd close his eyes and feel his way up the stairs so that he could pretend none of this was happening. But he took his inability as a sign. He owes it to them. With a swift burst of strength, he looks, and there laid what he can assume as the remains of Dez's body. A bloodied white suit with a scorched hole in the lapel sat limp over the skeleton. Dez's signature deep blue suede hat laid on the ground next to him. A small handgun sat loosely in his hand. The weight of the man's new body was nothing compared to the weight of the pain that now coursed through his very being.
He stumbled backwards as the reality of this life came crashing down through him. He wanted to throw up, or scream, or cry, or have any kind of outlet for this pain, but nothing happened. He wasn't even entirely sure he was physically capable of doing any of those things now. So he sat and tried to compose himself. He managed to quiet his mind and simply exist within the world for a few moments before rising back to his feet. He reached over and plucked the gun from Dez's hand, then tucked it into one of the many pouches and compartments the suit came installed with. He took his hat and laid it on his chest over the hole in his suit before carefully lifting the skeleton into his arms. Gently and heavily focused on not collapsing, he climbed the stairs out into the greenhouse, where there laid 4 bodies of heavily equipped and armored men, all brandishing the same logo as the company who established the blockade around the planet. Rage swelled through the man as he tried his best to make sense of this, but despite his best efforts, it didn't make sense. How can people be allowed to make their own law? Take good lives, oppress entire planets, simply because they have money? The rage took control of him as its need to be dispelled eroded him down to his soul. His knees buckled as his vision began to blur. Dez's skeleton fell from his shaking hands before he brought them up to what he believed to be his new face. He held the cold metal of his own helm in his hands as if he were trying to tear it off. The bulbs began to hum as their glow shifted from its original deep orange into a striking white. The hum was soon drowned out by a roar, primal yet twisted by a robotic pitch, muffled underneath the thick metal of the suit. This roar shook the very air around the man, as if lightning had struck the ground beneath him. He slumped down as his hands fell limply between his legs and rested in the grass. He took a moment to fully understand his surroundings. Though there was death, corruption, and misery, the unyielding force of nature had begun to consume it all and create something new. The flowers that grew here had sprung from their containers and taken hold of the entire greenhouse. Vines climbed the walls and shaded over the windows. Mushrooms grew in the corner near the tanks of water. Life had continued, despite everything. The man's heart tightened with resolve. He was to be like nature, unyielding, strong, determined. He was to go on and go forth. He owed these men his life countless times over, and would not let their spirits be consumed by time. He stood, once again with Dez's body in his arms. He looked down and dwelled for a moment on how he found Dez. If Cash were still alive, he'd have come for Dez's body. I have to bring them together again. He stepped through the broken doors that led out of the greenhouse and scanned the area. Everything was similar to how he'd remembered it, save for the sea of flowers that had taken the land as far as he could see. He caught no wind of Cash's body, but he did see a shed with one of the windows busted out in a perfect circle. He took a moment to harden his mind, as he placed Dez's body on the ground, then entered. Placed peacefully in front of the window, slumped over a now stained desk, were the remains of Cash's exoskeleton, which were eerily clean and undamaged, save for the hole punched through his head. The man spoke, his soft and low voice coming through the suit with a slight static and an artificial distortion.
Fucking cowards.
He placed his hand on Cash's head.
I know you would have taken out every last one of them.
He carried Cash outside, piece by piece, carefully reconstructing his shape next to Dez. He stood for a moment, debating where to bury them, and what to mark their graves with. Yet nothing felt right. Nothing felt worthy of the love they had spread through the universe. Instead, he carried them to an open clearing where their flowers had taken root. He cleared a small circle of the flowers, then spread their petals within that circle. He laid their bodies together over the bed of petals, and took a moment to be with his friends. As the sun began to set, he took his leave for town. Chapter 5. Conception. After roughly an hour of stumbling down the remnants of a dirt road leading to the town, the man could see lights resting on the horizon. Cautiously, he approached, trying his best to seem in control of his movements as to not be easy prey for the current corporate occupation. Yet the closer he got, the city seemed far more familiar than it was on his last visit. No patrolmen roaming the city. The only evidence of the occupying force were the flags and trucks that now lay destroyed and burned in the streets. Varying people of all species and backgrounds rushed from one building to the other with focused intention. Relief swept through the man as he felt the comfort of familiarity, though it was quickly disrupted. I know I was down for a while, but long enough for a war to be waged and won? The confusion that poured through him made him painfully aware of his exhaustion. He needed to rest, but nobody's safe out in the open here, especially if they're showing some form of weakness. He held himself high, trying his best to pretend he wasn't on the verge of crumbling, as he searched the city streets for a safe place to rest, and maybe get some answers. After some time, he found himself in familiar territory, so he made his way to a lounge that he used to frequent, hoping it was still standing. The owner was as close to decent as most people who thrive in this city get, though there was no way she was going to let him rest there for free. So upon reaching the building, which stood with a crude sign fashioned from an old plank that read Paradise in painted letters, he began looking for a way to borrow some funds. He leaned his back against the wall of the building and began eyeing the people passing by until he spotted a slow-moving figure, covered with a tattered black cloak. He watched the figure for a moment, trying to justify stealing from them. They probably stole everything they have, right? So it's not even really stealing if it wasn't theirs to begin with. He clenched his fist and began wading through the crowd, trying to hype himself up to confront the figure. Either that or they've come to sightsee the misery of this lawless planet, torn by war, as if they were on vacation. Either way, they deserve this. This is a cold planet, with no sympathy for lost souls. I have to do this. His large mechanical arm shot through the crowd, and in one movement, he wrapped his left hand around the figure's neck and his right hand around their arm just above the elbow, so he could slip behind the figure and drag them into the nearest alleyway. Once they were both out of the crowd, he pivoted on his back foot and spun with the figure, and slammed them against the wall and leaned in to speak. His cold, glitchy voice rumbled in the figure's ear as it pushed and struggled against his grip.
Easy, easy. I just need a little bit of money. That's it. Just drop it on the floor there between your legs and you can go.
He kicked the figure's ankle with just enough force to push the figure's legs apart, and spoke again.
But if you try anything, I'll break your neck as easily as snapping a twig. Then I'll take everything from your corpse as compensation for the trouble.
The figure's voice echoed softly, like a low whisper with no origin. Okay, I have it in a thigh pack. You want to get it, or me?
You get it.
The figure said nothing. It just leaned very slightly downwards with their free hand, but as it began to reach, the man found himself holding nothing but the figure's robe. They'd disappeared, and in their place was a swirling wisp of black mist. The man tossed the robe to the side in frustration and tried to fan away the mist with his arms, but as he lifted his hand up, he found himself stuck within the mist as pressure surrounded his wrist. In an instant, the mist seemingly imploded to create and reveal the figure's true form. A wispy, somewhat human shape of pure darkness, its only defining features being its long and powerful tail that swayed rhythmically behind it, its narrow red eyes that seemed to glow against its body, and its sharp-toothed, malicious grin that stretched from one side of its face to the other. It stood on the man, one foot on his chest and the other on his shoulder, with his arm locked against its body with its left hand. The man was too stunned to retaliate before the figure reached down and grabbed a hold of his metallic helm and kicked off of the wall with its right foot, sending them both across the alleyway. As the man struggled to maintain his balance while stumbling backwards, the figure planted both its feet and kicked off of him, launching him flat against the wall. The man gasped for air he didn't know he had as surges of deep and twisting pain shot through his head and back. He cut his vision upwards to find the figure had burrowed its claws into the wall opposite to him so that it may stay clung to it, roughly 13 feet off the ground. He stared into its eyes for a moment before it coiled its tail and launched downwards at the man, most of its body clouded by black mist that rolled and trailed behind it as it dove for him. With one movement, and only moments to spare, the man dipped his head and flung his heavy arm overhead with the heel of his open hand aimed directly at the figure's face. The figure's claws barely glanced off of the back of the man's helm as his arm made solid contact across its chest and neck. All of the figure's momentum was forced back through its body, causing it to violently snap and fold before being launched backwards into the wall it just shot from. It hit flat, causing some cracks in the wall before sliding down onto the ground, just barely catching itself on its hands and one knee. It let out guttural coughs, which forced a few drops of blood out into its mouth. It looked upwards and found itself about 2 feet from the man's jagged metal knee, which was trained right at the center of his head. Instantly, it turned into mist and looped around the man, whose knee was now buried into the side of the building. The figure reformed and took a moment to breathe. Pain surged through his entire body, almost as fast as his thoughts. I can't take another one of those. But this thing is slow. It's pretty shit range. Don't get greedy. The man cut a glance over his shoulder, his amber eyes now glowing a searing white. Before he could fully turn, the figure planted a firm kick directly into his ribs and slipped away before the man's right hook could land. They fought like this for about 10 minutes, neither making any kind of progress. The man was too slow to land any of his hits, but the pressure he put forth didn't allow the figure to put out much damage in return. They stood across from each other, both exhausted and fighting for air, with the figure's grin pulled down into a slight frown, the man's lights now back to their deep amber color. The man began trying to rub his aching muscles, but was met with no relief through the cold frame of the suit. He takes a moment to study the figure's body language. It's tired, but not nearly as tired as him, and it seems eager to strike at the first chance it can get, like a coiled snake. He can't go much longer, so his only hope is to find another way out of this. He let out a slight, breathy chuckle before speaking through the distortion of the suit.
What's the matter? Tired from all that running away?
The figure's grin returned, and it spoke louder this time, its voice more solid. You're one to talk about being tired. I didn't even know robots could fatigue. You must be cheap.
I'm not a robot. But if I'm so cheap, then why don't you plant your foot in the tire and slug it out with me? Big, strong shadow demon like you should be able to take me right apart.
Shadow demon? It stood up straight and pointed to the man. Yeah, you're definitely no robot. Even the dumbest of combat units are equipped with some kind of knowledge on shades. You're completely clueless, and it shows. You've got the strength, skill, and durability to beat me. Only thing holding you back is your stupidity. The man stared at the ground for a moment, pondering what information he had on shades, then spoke.
I've heard of you guys before. You could break down into mist, slightly alter your form, and emit concentrated mist at varying temperatures at will.
The figure could almost feel the smugness in the man's voice as he spoke.
That explains why you're so spineless.
Fuck you. Take off that suit and then we could talk about who's a coward.
I'm not in this because I want to be. Once I can take it off, I swear I'll be happy to put you in the ground.
You can't take the suit off? The figure said with pure curiosity in its voice. The entire flow of the conversation halted in an instant. The man spoke, now in a far softer tone. No, not right now at least. Well, when can you take it off?
I don't know. They said I'd know when the time was right.
They?
The Soul Seekers. The suit's like a life support system.
I thought the Soul Seekers died in a raid. The man clenched his fist and took a moment to swallow the pain lumping in his throat. He spoke softly, with his voice coming through more distorted and glitched again.
They did. You knew them?
Kinda. I did some odd jobs for him here and there. I knew of their work, but never saw it firsthand.
The man gestured to his robotic form and spoke.
Well, now you have. I'm their living legacy.
The figure laughed. I didn't think there were any left. Or something like local legends, you know.
Trust me. I know.
The man scanned around the area, then cut his vision back to the figure.
You ever been to the lounge up the road? Paradise?
He said as he pointed to the sign, which was just barely visible from the alleyway. The figure scratched the back of his head. No, I don't think so.
Let's go. I got a couple questions for you.
Why the hell would I follow you, a stranger, into a random creepy building after you just tried to rob me?
Because of my undeniable charm and your curious nature, coupled with the fact that we're both a light breeze away from passing out and getting stripped clean by any one of these people on the main road the second we fall.
The figure narrowed its eyes, trying to hide the laughter brewing behind its stone face. It thought for a moment before picking its robe up and gesturing towards the road. Lead the way. The man nodded politely as they both stepped out into the flow of the crowd. They slowly commanded their aching bodies to push through the swarm of people. Loudly, over the general rustle, the man spoke, his voice now smoother and lower, though still robotic.
What's your name?
The figure cut its eyes over to the man and spoke softly. Kifo. And you? The man was silent for a moment. Feelings, thoughts, and memories were taking him over, and in an act of blissful strength, he shed them away. This was his chance to begin being who he was supposed to be, a reawakening where he could become his truest self, inside and out. He pushed from the crowd and stood next to Kifo in front of Paradise, both their gazes fixed on where their futures could be headed, and their hearts lingering on what this meeting could mean. He spoke, his voice soft and low, but completely sure.
My name is Comet. It's a pleasure, Kifo.